Today I'm going to share with y'all some information from the new Bible handbook by G.T. Manley, a survey of Old Testament introduction by Gleason Archer. This one right here is an old book. Defeating Darwinism by Phillip Johnson. An introduction to textual criticism. Unholy Hands on the Bible by Dean John Burgon and J.P. Green, the same person who does the Interlinear Bible, and Dumbing Us Down by John GATTO. So what I want to connect for y'all is the way that biblical scholarship and textual criticism, the higher and lower criticism, has become a form of syncretism with the Darwinian scholarship. So all of this happened in the 18th century. So let me state that again. What we're going to be looking at is how biblical scholarship has been merged with Darwinian thinking and neo-Darwinian logic here in the 21st century. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open this right here. Now, you could say that this was the popularization of ideas that have existed for thousands of years, all the way back to the Stoics and Epicureans, and even in the Bible it says, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." So right here, this book right here, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of the Favored Races in the Struggle for Life by Charles Darwin, was published in 1859. Now I want you to keep that date in mind, 1859, because we can really get the feel of how things started going downhill very quickly as these ideas became more synchristic with everybody's thoughts in the 18th century, 19th century, and the 20th century. So we can see how all of this is coming to a head. So this book right here, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, was published in 1871, and this is where Darwin is really racist, and he's really putting things into perspective of the socially applied Darwinism, the same kind of thing that Hitler had in mind about the master races and the kinds of effects it would have if, say, a European bred with an Irishman, and he would say that that would cause a crippling effect on like the British. If the British intermingled with the Irish, that would be a huge problem for the genetics, and it would cause the descent of man. That's why I was saying the descent of man. Okay, so you saw that date, 1859 over here, when this was published, and then Descent of Man about 12 years later in 1871. Now, the big problem that Darwinism creates, and you might already know this is obvious, is that it means that there's no metaphysical, there is no there's nothing above man, there's nothing outside of man. So it says here, naturalism and materialism mean essentially the same thing for present purposes, and so I use the term interchangeably. Naturalism means that nature is all there is. Materialism means that matter, that is the fundamental particles that make up both matter and energy, is all there is. Because evolutionary naturalists insist that nature is made up of those particles, there is no difference between naturalism and materialism. In other contexts, however, the terms may have different meanings. Materialism is sometimes used to mean greedy for material possession, as in he who dies with the most toys wins. Naturalism also has quite different meanings in other contexts, such as art and literary criticism. These other meanings are irrelevant for our purposes. So science, the way they define it today, through the demarcation of language, saying this is all it can mean, and because of consensus opinions, the people who are in charge, they say this is all that science can mean, and so it just means nothing can be spiritual. And we know the scriptures say the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit, for they are foolishness to him, neither can he know them, for they are spiritually discerned. And then again, we already quoted, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So I'm going to go ahead and skip forward here, and then I'm going to relate to how this relates to biblical studies, biblical criticisms. I'm going to define for you what those criticisms are. But first I wanted to read to you this excerpt from a book by John GATTO, and I'll put the name in the description below, Dumbing Us Down, the Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling. So right here it explains, our form of compulsory schooling is an invention of the state of Massachusetts around 1850. Oh, well, we saw the date that The Origin of Species was published, and we see how this is starting to relate to those times and how ideas were starting to emerge. It was resisted, sometimes with guns, by an estimated 80% of the Massachusetts population. They didn't want this thing. They were going to fight to make sure school didn't arise. The last outpost in Barnstable on Cape Cod not surrendering its children until the 1880s, when the area was seized by militia and children marched to school under guard. Now here is a curious idea to ponder. Senator Ted Kennedy's office released a paper not too long ago claiming that prior to compulsory education, the state literacy rate was 98%, and that after it, the figure never exceeded 91%, where it stands in 1990. Here is another curiosity to think about. The homeschooling movement has quietly grown to a size where 1.5 million young people are being educated entirely by their own parents. Last month, the Education Press reported the amazing news that in their ability to think, children schooled at home seem to be 5 or even 10 years ahead of their formerly trained peers. I don't think we'll get rid of schools anytime soon, certainly not in my lifetime, but if we're going to change what's rapidly becoming a disaster of ignorance, we need to realize that the school institution schools very well. So it schools very well. That's what it's designed to do. Though it does not educate, it schools, it doesn't educate. That's inherent in the design of the thing. It's not the fault of bad teachers or too little money spent. It's just impossible for education and schooling ever to be the same thing. Schooling and education are not the same thing. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and define criticism. The higher criticism of the Bible has been the cause of much controversy, and it is desirable to understand how this has come about. Criticism, in its grammatical sense, means no more than the exercise of judgment. When applied to literature, textual criticism refers to the study of ancient manuscripts in order to recover the best original text, whereas higher criticism is the term used for the discussion of date, authorship, etc. by means of internal and external evidence. So to make that hit a little more home, nobody has an original manuscript of the Bible. There is not one known that has the actual signature of the original author. All we have is copies. That's an important fact when you enter into this debate, because everyone's arguing over copies and which copies are best. So it says, using the neutral sense, biblical criticism, both textual and higher, is something not only permissible, but commendable if pursued in reverent and, if pursued in reverent and scholarly fashion, in the proper sense of, in the proper sense of the word, critical studies have been pursued by the early fathers, by the reformers and by Christian scholars up to the present day, all of whom have been fully persuaded of the divine authority of the Scripture. But in the period which followed the destructive theology of the latter half of the 18th century, that's what we said, and that's what we've shown. See, these ideas were emerging that only materialism exists, so that's how they define science. They define it by naturalism and materialism. And so in the 1859, when the evolution became a big deal, and then in 1871 he published The Descent of Man, and in around the 1850 in America, schools were beginning to emerge, which used to be something that rich kids did. It wasn't so broad-based as it became, and we saw that people resisted it with guns, and now it's taken over to show the kind of tyrannical life we're living now, because they believe in this aristocratic, or these academies and this higher form of hierarchical government that didn't exist in the Bible at all. And they're using these methods to slowly try to control people into thinking like, this is it, this is all there is, there's no afterlife. So we'll go on here. There arose a school of criticism in conformity with it. Early studies by Eckhorn, 1783, DeWaite, 1805, and Ewald, 1823, resulted in a documentary hypothesis of the Pentateuch, which assigned its origin to the combination of a series of documents, the first of which was not committed to writing until 4 or 5 centuries after the death of Moses. So they don't believe that Moses wrote the Bible. The latter half of the 19th century, after many changes and adaptations, this hypothesis began to take on a stable form at the hands of two brilliant, two brilliant Hebrew scholars, Graf and Wellhausen. Not believing in the possibility of miracle, they elaborated a theory which pictures the religion of Israel as a gradual evolution from primitive animism through a stage when Jehovah was taken as a tribal god. And you could apply this to the way they view Allah as well. And Allah was a tribal god. We know he was. And Jehovah was a tribal god because it was the Abraham and his follow-on people who received it. But they're talking about going from pantheism to polytheism to transcendence. That's what they mean here. And that means to say, first they thought the water was God, then they thought there was a God of water. So, and then eventually they said, okay, well, there's a God over everything. Like, there's not the tree isn't God. There's not a God of the trees. The water's not God. And it's not the God of water. But there's this transcendent God above all. So they're saying because they believe in evolution, that's how it evolved. It evolved to transcendence. Like the gods of the heathen, until under the influence of the latter prophets, a lofty level of monotheism was reached. The whole Old Testament was radically affected by this theory. The sources of the various books were dated in accordance with it, using as a criterion the stage of the development which they were thought to reflect. So because they believe in evolution, they assigned the dates in the scheme that they felt mirrored what they believe about evolution. The late dating of the documents. Okay, so that's all I wanted to show there. So here it says, before commencing a higher critical study of the Old Testament, it is appropriate for us to come to terms with the basic question of what kind of book it is, referring to the Bible. If it is merely a product of human genius, like many other documents upon which religions have been founded, then the data which it presents must be handled in one specific way. That is, these holy writers must be dealt with in purely literary terms. And naturalistic explanations, there's that word naturalistic we defined a moment ago, must be found for every feature which appears to be supernatural, such as fulfilled prophecy. If, on the other hand, the 39 books of the Old Testament are inspired by God, employing human instruments to record the truth revealed to man, then the data must be handled in a quite different fashion. That is to say, everything which might appear to be inconsistent with that standard of accuracy and truth which divine inspiration presupposes must be carefully investigated in order to arrive at a satisfactory reconcilement of apparent discrepancies. Thus, the whole line of investigation is profoundly influenced by the premise with which we start. So whether you start with an evolutionary premise or whether you start with a divine inspiration premise, those are two different worldviews, two complete different paradigms. There's no way to syncretize them. There's no way to make them ecumenalize. They cannot be, ecumenism cannot exist here. They will not combine, ever. So here we look again at the definition of lower criticism and higher criticism. So lower criticism of the Old Testament, in contradistinction to higher criticism, which deals with questions of the authorship and integrity of the text of Bible books, which we looked at a moment ago, and the one we looked at a minute ago was G.T. Manley, and this one and the one I did right before this is Gleason Archer. So questions of the authorship and integrity of the text of the Bible books, the science of lower criticism or textual criticism, is concerned with the task of restoring the original text on the basis of the imperfect copies which have been preserved to us. It attempts to sift the evidence provided by the variance of different readings, where the surviving manuscripts disagree with each other, and by the use of a scientific system arrive at what was most probably the wording used by the original author. Okay, so there you have it. We've looked at these. We've looked at G.T. Manley here in these. And this right here, this is Gleason Archer. And we've defined what higher and lower criticism is. And I'm also trying to keep y'all in a frame of reference there of how these lines of thought were emerging in the 18th century, but they go way back. Like people have been saying forever that this is all there is and there's no afterlife. So have fun, enjoy your life now, your best life now, right? Like Joel Osteen, that's what he would say. But the best life begins when you're born again. Okay, so now we're going to look in Dean John Burgon and get an idea of some of these dates here and how this criticism was coming about. So it says, "Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge?" Job 38, verse 2. "And he spoke a parable to them. Can the blind lead the blind? Shall they not both fall in the ditch? Into a ditch?" Luke 6, verse 39. Proposing to ourselves, May 17th, 1881, to inquire into the merits of the recent revision, and it's talking about Westcott and Hort. So you have The Origin of Species in 1859, you have The Descent of Man in 1871, and then you have this whole new biblical text that comes out in 1881 by Westcott and Hort, which has gone into most of the new translations. So let me start again here. Proposing to ourselves to inquire into the merits of the recent revision of the authorized version of the New Testament Scriptures, we speedily became aware that an entirely different problem awaited us and demanded preliminary investigation. We made the distressing discovery that the underlying Greek text had been completely refashioned throughout. It was accordingly not so much a revised English version as a new Greek text, which was challenging public acceptance. Premature, therefore, not to say preposterous, would have been any inquiry into the degree of ability with which the original Greek had been rendered into English by our revisionists until we had first satisfied ourselves that it was still the original Greek with which we had to deal, or whether it had been the supreme infelicity of a body of scholars claiming to act by the authority of the sacred synod of Canterbury, to put themselves into the hands of some ingenious theory monger, and to become the dupes of any of the strange delusions which are found, unhappily, still to prevail in certain quarters on the subject of textual criticism. Let me see. Okay, so I wanted to read that to you because that is showing you that they're talking about the criticism and what Westcott and Hort did to this. They completely changed the original Greek that was written down, and they used the lower criticism to put together all of these different manuscripts into what they felt was the most accurate text. And they did it by collating text, which means to lay them all beside, and then they picked out the ones that they thought were most accurate. Okay, so it says here, of the oldest, sorry, I meant to start reading right here. So Tisseldorf, the last and by far the ablest critic of the three, knew better than to reject 89/90ths of the extant witnesses. He had recourse to the ingenious expedient of adducing all the available evidence, but adopting just as little of it as he chose, and he chose to adopt those readings only which are vouched for by the same little band of authorities whose partial testimony had already proved fatal to the decrees of Lockman and Tregelles. Happy in having discovered in 1859, the same year that Origin of Species was published, Charles Darwin's book was published, a unsealed codex, Aleph, second in antiquity only to the oldest before known, B, and strongly resembling Codex B in the character of its contents. He suffered his judgment to be overpowered by the circumstance. He at once, 1865 to 72, remodeled the 7th edition, 1856 to 1859, in 3,505 places to the scandal of the science of comparative criticism, as well as to his own grave discredit for discernment and consistency. Scrivener's Introduction, page 429. And yet he knew concerning Codex Aleph that at least 10 different revisers from the 5th century downwards had labored to remedy the scandalously corrupt condition of a text which, as it proceeded from the first scribe, even Tregelles describes as very rough. So we're seeing here this times and these thoughts that were already permeating, and lo and behold, in 1859, these same ideas of evolution are becoming popular, and so it's reframing the way that higher and lower criticism are done, because it's viewing it as strictly material and naturalistic. That at this point, they're not even looking at text anymore as though they believe in God for the most part. It's just taking on this new naturalistic and materialistic ideas that have become popular, following the multitude to do evil. It's no longer believed that it's inspired, an inspired text inspired by God, which is wicked. And that's what John Dean Burgon here, he's identifying for you the way that this corruption happened. And these are the new corruptions that go into like the ESV and the NIV and the New English Version and the Easy Reading Version and the Amplified Version. So, and that's why these people endorse these, like R.C. Sproul and John MacArthur and John Piper, all Calvary Chapel, I guess, in general, are endorse the ESV. Joyce Myers, her big thing is endorsing the Amplified Version, and they are also, a lot of the other individuals are endorsing the NASB. So here it goes on to say, and that's not saying the received text, even though they would tear apart the received text to make this eclectic text, which is the collate text where they lay everything beside each other and just combine them. So it says the first thing here which unfavorably arrests attention is the circumstance that this proves to be the only critical edition of the New Testament since the days of Mill, which does not even pretend to contribute something to our previous critical knowledge of the subject. Mill it was, 1707, who gave us the great bulk of our various readings, which Bingle, 1734, slightly, and Westine, 1751-2, were very considerably enlarged. The accurate Mathai, 1782-78, acquainted us with the contents of about 100 codices more, and was followed by Grespach, 1796 to 1806 with important additional materials. Burke had, in the meantime, 1788, culled from the principal libraries of Europe a large assortment of new readings, while truly marvelous was the ascension of evidence which Scholz brought to light in 1830, and through Lockman, 1842 to 50, did wondrous little in this department. He yet furnished the critical authority, such as it is, for his own unsatisfactory text, Tregelles, 1857 to 72, by his exact collations of manuscripts, so laying them beside one another. An examination of the earliest fathers, and that's important to do because that helps preserve how old these things actually are. In many ways shows who actually corrupted it and made it up. So, has laid the church under an abiding obligation. And what is to be said of Tischendorf, 1856 to 72, who has contributed more to our knowledge than any other editor of the New Testament since the days of Mill? Dr. Scrivener, though he has not independently edited the original text, is clearly to be reckoned among those who have, by reason of his large, important and accurate contributions to our knowledge of ancient documents, transferred his collections of various readings to the foot of the page of a copy of the commonly received text, and Scrivener's New Testament might stand between the editions of Mill and Wettstein. Lest the truth be told, C.F. Mathai and he are the only two scholars who have collated any considerable number of sacred codices with the needful amount of accuracy. All right, so we've looked at the books here, and as I'm trying to show you, let me go back to the beginning. Okay, so this was published, The Origin of Species, and it's a very racist book in 1859. It gives the rise to perfect class separation, class stratification. It gives rise to perfect racism. It gives rise to perfect greed and perfect evil, as we saw Hitler was a little example of that. And this one right here was published in 1871, and so for example, it's saying, like, for example, if a white person were to marry a black person and they had a baby, that baby would be doomed because of its genetics. That's the idea of that book there. So, and it has many other ideas. I mean, I'm just giving you one idea out of it. And this whole higher criticism and lower criticism now is based off of naturalism and materialism, which means there can't be a God. So it sets out with the foundation of finding the oldest books and then discredits the whole thing and says, okay, well, there's not a God because these manuscripts aren't old. And then in 1881, when Westcott and Hort published their revised version, we see how all these timelines are linking together here, so it makes sense of these corruptions. This right here shows a bit of the history of how they were preserving it or looking to preserve it, and how it kind of backfired in our century, and with the lines of thinking that are inherent now. Okay. And here we defined higher criticism, lower criticism. And here you see a lot of these names here of people who were scholars as well. So, okay, and we also see how schooling is becoming the education system now, and the elite force it on us, the tyrannical and the despotism that we're living in forces these things upon us and makes it to where you become schooled and you become a good working class citizen. And this relates to the eugenics policies and the adoption agency of school and how they are causing us to become more ignorant as a society, because they school us so we can become workers for industry. And this is also how materialism has taken over the concepts of inspired scripture and has rendered people basically incapable of learning, or at least artificially extending their childhood until something happens that makes them want to learn, like trauma. So just to let me verify a fact real quick, so I want to make sure that I had that right. I'm going to type in Westcott and Hort's publish of revised version. Sorry if I just want to be positive. Yes, 1881. The New Testament in the original Greek is a Greek language version of the New Testament published in 1881. So they completely redid the Greek, though. That's why most people do not, or actually most of the world likes the NIV. That's the most popular Bible now, which is based off of the Westcott and Hort revised version, where they changed the Greek text. And that's why so many people actually cling to the KJV and say KJV only. Now, I've done a lot of work showing how the clergy, laity, pulpit, pew, the translation of the word church, the bishop of the office of the bishop, the office of the deacon, the office of the priesthood. Even when it says they have not the same office, that's supposed to say function. So it's important to know how they translated it in the scheme of how governments and false teachers, that would be called the leaven of the scribes and Sadducees, or sorry, the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, the leaven of Herod, worked together in order to subdue the people, as it says in Genesis chapter 6:4, when it says that there were tyrants on the earth in those days. And that's the same thing Jesus is referring to when he says it will be as it was in the days of Noah, when we're married and given in marriage, when truth is marrying a lie, the sons of God marrying the daughters of men, which is the same thing in 2 Corinthians 6 when it says, what does Christ have to do with Belial? And speaking of the way that we marry our ideas together with paganism, and we see that in the church with the wheel of the year, the way that Christmas, Easter, trick or treat, and Halloween, and the Saint Valentine's, Saint Patrick, Saint Nicholas, and the way that all of this paganism is merging with people who think that they believe the truth, but they don't actually believe the truth. So the tyrants are subduing us, the false teachers are subduing us, and it takes a miracle of God to break us out of this. So, and we see how nowadays people don't even believe the truth because they don't even think the truth exists, because they've turned their minds over to evolution. And all of this has to do with the Bible when it says God will send them strong delusion that they will believe a lie. This has to do with what it says in Daniel with the abomination of desecration sitting in the temple, because our bodies are the temple, and our body means the people we hang with, we fellowship with. So the body of the world, the majority, believes Satan and follows Satan, and we see the outer working and demonstration of Satan through his inner working. You could call that the sacrament of Satan, because it has not. We know this has nothing to do with eating crackers and grape juice or dunking people in water. And you don't see people preaching the word, which is the outer sign of God's inward work, is that you believe and you act and you conduct yourself as a Christian in society. It's all been taken over, and we see that the apostasy is upon us, and now we wait for the end. So, okay, I hope that this has been educating for you, to show you the way that all of these ideas have become synchronized and come together to overthrow people's mindsets, overthrow people's minds, which overthrows their bodies and makes it very confusing to be alive and understand what a purpose in life is and things of that nature. So, all right, I hope this helps, and thanks for watching. Bye.